Down. I'm joined by Brigadier General Robert Spalding, former Senior Strategy Director at the U.S. National Security Council. So, tell us about these new sanctions from the State Department. How are they going to make it harder for Chinese diplomats to do their job?
Well, I think it's less about that. It's more about requesting reciprocity from the Chinese Communist Party. For decades, we've been asking to treat our diplomats in China the same way we treat Chinese diplomats in the United States, which is they can travel anywhere around the United States they want. In China, our diplomats are restricted to their host cities, and they have to apply to travel, and many times travel is rejected, particularly those places that the Chinese Communist Party don't want people to travel to, but really just about anywhere. And so this is about creating reciprocity and finally essentially restricting Chinese diplomats in the same way that our diplomats have been restricted for decades in China.
Now, we've seen, obviously, a lot of tit-for-tat moves between the U.S. and China, and experts fear that it's only going to get worse. But, how bad can it really get here?
Well, as I tell people, beyond what Dr. Kissinger talked about being in the foothills of a Cold War, we are entering a new Cold War period, and the world is resolving into a bipolar order. And the Chinese Communist Party sits at the center of that bipolar order. So I would expect that the same kind of restrictions, the same kind of technology export restrictions, the same kind of travel restrictions are going to increasingly apply when it comes to particularly between the U.S. and China, but also between the U.S. and her allies in China.
Well, how do you think we're going to potentially see China react to this latest move by the United States?
Well, I think the Chinese look at the Belt and Road Initiative as their effort, in addition to the authoritarian regimes like Russia, Iran, North Korea, as being the way that they're going to wrap in the emerging market societies into their side of the bipolar order. They're using essentially infrastructure investment and their technological advantage and their resources of their very large number 2 economy in the world to really project their power in ways that are akin to the Marshall Plan during the post-World War II and beginnings of the Cold War aftermath, and then certainly in Japan and Korea and Asia.
So it seems that you're speaking about Chinese expansion in developing nations and developing parts of the world to get access to resources. I mean, what areas of the world is the United States most concerned about China, getting involved in?
Well, I think really there's a recognition that they are now a global power, particularly with regards to information and economics and finance and trade, and we have to deal with them as such. And they use their power in much different ways than the U.S. has traditionally looked at an adversary. We've traditionally looked at an adversary primarily in the military domain, but what we're talking about here is economic and financial and trade, all of that being used for economic coercion and influence, and certainly the information environment, like the global internet, like the digital Silk Road, where the Chinese Communist Party seeks to influence populations, that are beyond, what was capable in the first Cold War. So they have access to every American citizen. They have access to nearly every citizen of every democracy through particularly social media platforms and e-commerce. So it's really a different environment in terms of protecting the sovereignty and independence of democracies when they're faced with the overwhelming might of the Chinese Communist Party and its authoritarian information-based economic system.
I mean, what is the U.S. the most concerned about when it comes to China? Could you pinpoint one specific thing?
Oh, I think it's really the undermining of legitimate democratic principles, rule of law, free trade, civil liberties, human rights, not just in America, really all around the world. We see there's influence on individual citizens through coercive relationships between Chinese companies and American companies. We also see the undermining of international institutions like the United Nations and the World Health Organization. So it is writ large the undermining of democratic principles and rule of law in the international system and democracies around the world.
All right, Brigadier General Robert Spalding, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down. I think